All right, let's get right into it. We are digging into the incredible and, let's be honest, tragic story of one of gaming's most fascinating rulers, the Pale King of Hallownest. I mean, this is a story about a god who literally built a paradise from the ground up and then, in a desperate attempt to save it, ended up sacrificing everything, and I mean everything, including his own children.
You know, if you want to understand a Pale King, you just need to remember these four little words: no cost too great. And look, this wasn't just some royal motto on a crest. Oh no, this was his entire philosophy. It was the absolute guiding principle of a king who believed his kingdom was this eternal project, something worth any and every sacrifice.
So that begs a pretty big question, right? What happens when that cost becomes, well, everything? What happens when the price you pay to save something is so ridiculously high that it ends up destroying the very thing you were trying to protect? Yeah, that's the tragedy. That's the core of what we're going to unpack here.
Okay, so to really get the Pale King, we have to go back, way back. See, he wasn't always this, small, crowned ruler. Before all that, he started as something much, much bigger, something ancient, and honestly, kind of terrifying. So what in the world is a worm? Think of it less like a creature and more like a force of nature. We're talking about these colossal, almost godlike beings that just burrowed through wastelands for, well, who knows how long. And there was this prophecy, right? That one of them would eventually settle down, choose a kingdom, and be reborn. And when you know it, that prophecy came true. Our worm finds its way to a place called Kingdom's Edge, sheds this absolutely massive shell, you can actually find it in the game, and is reborn. But here's the crazy part. It chose to become smaller. It deliberately shrunk itself down to the size of the bugs in Hallownest. That was a conscious decision, to go from this wandering, godlike titan to a king who could rule over them. And man, for a while there, it worked. It really, really worked. This decision didn't just create a kingdom, it created a genuine utopia. The Pale King's rule was, without a doubt, Hallownest's golden age. We're talking about a time of incredible prosperity, art, and enlightenment. I mean, the scale of what he accomplished is just mind-blowing. He didn't just conquer lands, he created a society. He literally granted the bugs of Hallownest sapience, a mind, a will of their own. That's a gift from a god. He built all this incredible infrastructure, like the stagways and the trams we travel through. He even managed to unite all these different groups, like the moth tribe and the mushrooms and the fungal wastes. And what did he ask for in return? Just their devotion, as he promised them a kingdom that would stand for all eternity.
But here's the thing about promising eternity. It's a pretty fragile thing. And that old god the moths were convinced to forget, well, she didn't forget about them. And this is where everything starts to go wrong, where the cracks in this perfect kingdom begin to show.
And the threat wasn't what you'd expect, like an invading army. No, this was so much worse. It came from within. This ancient forgotten god called the Radiance. She started to seep back into the consciousness of Hallownest. And she did it through the one place the king had absolutely no control over, his subjects' dreams. This is what created the infection, a terrifying plague of the mind that literally stole a bug's free will and turned them back into these mindless, aggressive husks.
So just think about that for a second. That's the impossible problem the king is facing. How in the world do you fight a plague that spreads through dreams? You can't fight it with a nail, you can't build a wall high enough to keep out an idea. The Pale King, this being of pure reason and logic, was up against an enemy that completely broke all the rules.
So backed into a corner with this impossible enemy, what does he do? He falls back on the only thing he knows, his core belief, no cost too great. And that motto, it became the justification for a plan that was, well, it was absolutely brilliant and at the same time, completely and utterly horrifying. Okay, get this. The plan was basically to trap the plague, to bottle it up. He figured he had to seal the radiance away, but not in some magic box. No, he needed to trap her inside a living prison, a being he called a vessel. But for this to work, for this vessel to contain the consciousness of a god, it had to be perfect. It had to be completely, totally, 100% empty inside. And how he went about creating this vessel it's monstrous. He and his queen, the White Lady, they had literally thousands of children down in this awful dark place called the Abyss. Every single one of them was infused with this substance called the Void, this ancient mindless power that's basically the polar opposite of the radiance's light. The hope was that one of them would be born with nothing. No mind to think, no will to break, no voice to even cry out. And after who knows how many failures, they finally found one they thought was pure. This child would become the Hollow Knight.
But this is the fatal flaw in the whole plan. The whole thing hinges on the vessel being a perfect, empty container, right? But what was the reality? The Pale King himself raised this child. He formed a bond with it. And that simple, paternal connection, that was the impurity. It tarnished the vessel. It planted an idea, a memory, a feeling of love for its father. Just a tiny crack, but a crack was all the radiance needed to eventually break free. Think about that. A single moment of fatherly affection was the undoing of an entire civilization. The king's own love for his child, the one human or, bug-like emotion his grand logical plan couldn't account for, that's what would bring his entire kingdom to ruin.
So, they sealed the Hollow Knight away inside the Temple of the Black Egg. But the seal wasn't perfect, was it? Because the vessel wasn't truly hollow. That little bit of impurity meant the radiance wasn't fully trapped. The infection started to leak out again. Just a little at first. And then, like a dam breaking, it came roaring back to consume the very kingdom it was all meant to save.
And the fall of Hallownest after that? It's just swift and brutal. The vessel is sealed, the seal fails, the infection comes back worse than ever. And what does the Pale King do? He makes his last, desperate move. He takes his entire palace and just vanishes, disappears from the physical world into the dream realm, completely abandoning his kingdom and his people to their fate. And so Hallownest just stops. It's frozen in time, this beautiful, sprawling corpse of a kingdom, completely overrun by the madness of the infection. And the great Pale King himself, the reborn worm, the radiant god? Well, his final fate is pretty bleak. He's eventually found in that hidden dream palace, not as some glorious god, but just as a tiny corpse, slumped over on his throne. A really lonely, quiet, and pathetic end for a king who once commanded a whole civilization and promised them immortality. Which brings us all the way back to the beginning, doesn't it? No cost too great. Well, the cost was the sanity of his people. The cost was the lives of thousands upon thousands of his own children. The cost was his kingdom, his legacy, everything. He paid the absolute highest price you could imagine, and in the end, he still failed. So looking at the ruins of Hallownest, you really have to ask yourself, was that vow a noble sacrifice, or was it just the greatest, most tragic miscalculation of all time?